Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to be getting started on making my floral fall jacket. So if you saw my recent fall fabric haul and sewing plans video, you would have seen that I picked up this really beautiful floral fabric from a fabric swap here in Toronto, and I think it's actually an upholstery weight fabric. But today we're going to be using this fabric to make a floral jacket for the fall, and I'm really excited about this project. Now, I had a lot of trouble deciding which pattern I wanted to use, but I have finally settled on the Friday Pattern Company Ilford jacket pattern. This pattern is for a workwear inspired kind of button-up jacket, and it's meant to be unisex, so it looks great on everyone. And there are a lot of different options with this pattern. It can be made at a longer length, more of a cropped length. There are tons of pocket options, and there's two different types of sleeves. I want to make the cropped length and the sleeves that have the sleeve plackets at the wrist. And I'll decide on the pockets later on in the video once I've kind of assembled the jacket. I'll add them at the end if I'm going to add any at all. And sorry to any of you who were hoping to see me sew up the Nova Coat or a Simplicity jacket pattern that I featured in my fall sewing plans. I just decided that because this is a really heavy upholstery weight fabric, I think this wouldn't be suitable for a super long jacket because I think it would just end up being really heavy. And I also looked at gaps in my wardrobe and I realized that what I'm missing is kind of like an easy to throw on button up jacket for the fall. So that's why I thought it would be a good choice to make this pattern instead. So Friday Pattern Company does have YouTube tutorials for most, if not all of their popular patterns. So I'm going to be following along with their YouTube tutorials to sew this. But yeah, let's jump into this pattern and get started. And the first step will be to get started on sewing the placket piece for the sleeves. Now, I've never made a placket before, so we're going to learn together as we go. So let's just get started on that. So let's get started on our placket. The first thing we're going to do is transfer the markings from the pattern piece to the side of the placket that has the interfacing on it. Next, we're going to fold and press in the two sides under at 1/4 inch. Then we're going to fold the peaked edge towards the right side of itself, and we want the peaks to meet. We're going to stitch 1/4 inch from the edge around that top triangular peak. Next, we're going to very carefully clip the seam allowance, so clip that point at the top without actually clipping into your seam line. Next, we're going to turn the placket right side out and press it so that the top triangular part looks neat and tidy. So next, you'll place your placket with the right side of the placket against the wrong side of the sleeve, and you'll match up notches at the bottom of the placket and the sleeve to make sure everything is lining up well. Then we're going to stitch around that rectangle we marked in the first step. And then we can carefully snip up the center line of that rectangle, as well as those triangular lines at the very top. So we're clipping as close to that seam allowance as possible without actually clipping through it. Then we flip the placket over to the right side and press it in place. For the edge of the placket that doesn't have the peaked top, we want to fold it under in half. You'll want to edge stitch up at the side of the placket, pivot at the top, and stitch across the top of the placket. Then finally fold the peaked edge of your placket in so that it covers the shorter edge you just made. Mark a line across the front where you're going to stitch across your placket, and this should catch both sides of the placket in one stitch. Okay, so I just finished one of these sleeve plackets, and I kind of knew going into this project that it was a bit of a chaotic decision to try to make sleeve plackets out of this super thick upholstery fabric, and I was definitely right. It was very, very hard. It was my first time doing sleeve plackets. I feel like understanding what you're supposed to do isn't hard because the instructions are so good, but this fabric is so thick that it was just really tough. I ended up muscling my way through, and I think it looks pretty decent from the right side. I was able to grade down some of the seam allowances and kind of trim down some of the insides of the placket to reduce the bulk a bit, but no doubt it's still a really bulky placket. I'm hoping it'll look a little bit better once the cuff is on and the button and everything like that. Okay, so now both of my plackets are done on my sleeves, and overall they're pretty good. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about how I'm going to finish the inside of this jacket. So I went back and forth about whether or not I wanted to line this, but I kind of wanted this jacket to feel almost like a denim jacket, something you just throw on that's really easy and light. And considering this fabric is already so heavy, I thought I wanted to make sure it didn't get too heavy, and I thought adding a lining might risk it getting really, really heavy. So to finish my seams, I'm going to use some bias binding. I picked up this bias binding off of Amazon. It's a really, really giant spool, as you can see. And when it comes to unlined jackets, I'm a fan of the way that bias binding looks on the inside. And for a fabric this bulky, I think there's just no other way really to get a neat finish. So now that my placket is sewn, I'm going to spend some time binding all of the edges of the pieces of this jacket before I sew it together. And then I'll be able to press the seam allowances open once the binding is on. For example, here is the edge of one of my sleeve pieces. And basically once the binding is in place, it will just kind of cover the raw edges like this. And then these seams can be pressed open once they're sewn together on the inside of the garment. So I just finished binding one of the sleeve pieces, and this is what it's looking like. I really like how the bias binding is working out. I think it's really neat and tidy, and it's going to look great when the seams are pressed open on the inside of the garment. What I ended up doing was using my fabric glue stick, and rather than opening up the bias tape and kind of using the traditional method, I just sandwiched the bias tape around the raw edge of my fabric, and then I used my fabric glue stick to hold the bias tape in place. I've been going along and finishing all the edges of my pieces with this bias tape, and then I got to the center front seam and I realized I didn't understand how the placket here would be finished. And so I looked forward in the instructions and I realized that the method they wanted you to use, where you kind of fold this under at a 1/4 inch and then fold the whole thing under again at a 1/2 inch, would result in a really bulky seam finish. And this fabric is obviously really, really thick, so I just don't think that would work out and it would be too bulky for the front. So I thought of a different way to finish this, so I just wanted to show you. So initially they wanted you to turn over this edge at a 1/4 inch to the wrong side. So I cut off this extra fabric, so I cut off this 1/4 inch strip from the center front seam because I won't need it anymore. And then what I'm going to do is just finish this seam with the bias tape like I've been doing with all my other seams. And then rather than turning this center front edge under a 1/4 inch before I fold it the whole thing to the right side, I'm just going to leave it flat, but the edge will be finished here by this bias tape. So then on the inside, you're going to have a clean finish. You'll just see the edge of this bias tape sticking out instead of like a folded under edge. And that's just going to reduce the bulk here at the neckline and at the hem, and it's going to make the whole front of the jacket a lot less bulky as well. So that's what I'm planning to do, and I'll let you know how it works out. So here's my other front piece, and you can see this one I've removed the 1/4 inch strip, but before I put the bias tape on to finish the raw edge, I need to attach my interfacing. Since this is going to be the placket, we need to reinforce it for buttons and buttonholes and all of that. I almost forgot my interfacing, so just make sure you do that before you go ahead and finish the edge with the bias tape. So good morning guys, it's Saturday morning and I wanted to update you about where I am with my jacket. So last night I finished binding all the seams of the pattern pieces for this jacket, and I'm really happy with how they're looking. They look really neat and tidy. So I just wanted to show you which seams of all these pieces I ended up finishing. So I'll zoom you in here. So first up, I have 2 of these sleeve pieces. We have our placket sewn in already that we did in the first step. And then I finished all of these edges other than the hem because we're going to attach the cuff here. I also have 2 of these front pieces, and I finished the side edges as well as the shoulder seam edge. I left this top neck edge unfinished since we'll be attaching our collar there, but I did do some stay stitching to make sure that it won't stretch out. And then this side is the placket side, and I already showed you guys I made some modifications to how I'm going to do the placket. So I'd cut a 1/4 inch off of the fabric here, and then I just finished this seam with my bias tape. And then finally I have this big piece, which is the back piece, and I finished the side edges as well as the shoulder edge for this piece on both sides. So I noticed as soon as I cut this fabric, it just starts to come apart and these thick woven threads just start to come off, and I didn't want this project to kind of unravel right in front of my eyes. So what I ended up doing before I added any bias binding on, I went around the perimeter of all of my pieces and did a zigzag stitch very close to the edge, and this will help to prevent the fabric from unfraying as I work with it, but it will also make the project stronger overall. This fabric is really interesting. It's kind of 2 different layers of fabric and they're attached at certain points on the design. I think around these dark brown areas is where they're attached and maybe in a few other spots. But this zigzag stitch along the edge will help to keep the 2 layers of fabric together as I'm working with them. Yeah, so the first thing we're going to want to do here is attach these front pieces to the back piece right sides together along the shoulder seam. So that is this seam line up here. And I'm going to do that for both of my front pieces. Once that's done, then we can insert the sleeve. And it looks like we're going to insert this sleeve kind of raglan style where we'll do it all in one go. So we'll do the side seam as well as the underarm seam all in one go. But first I will attach these pieces together along the shoulder seam, and then I'm going to press my seam allowances open. And we've already done the hard work of finishing the seam, so it should look really neat and tidy. This is the perfect time to whip out these fabric clips that I have since this project is so bulky. So once we have the shoulder seam sewn, we can attach the sleeves to the bodice. So right sides together, we want to pin our sleeve piece to the bodice, and we have both some notches and circles to help us match them up. We stitch between the circle marks, and you want to back stitch at the beginning and the end. And when you're done, you want to press your seam allowances open. Then we're going to sew the underarm seam as well as the side seam in one go. So right sides together, you want to start stitching at the underarm sleeve from the wrist, sew all the way up to the armpit area, and then stitch from that armpit down to the hem of the jacket. Okay guys, so now that we've finished the shell of the jacket, I wanted to take some time to show you what I'm going to do with the hem and the placket, and the 2 kind of go hand in hand. I decided to finish the bottom hemline with my bias tape the same way I've been doing throughout the whole project. And because we took so much time to press our seams open, I was able to finish the bias tape on top of those open seams, so everything looks really neat and tidy from the inside. And now that the bottom hem edge is finished with the bias tape, I'm just going to do a single fold hem. So I'm going to turn the hem edge under to the wrong side once at about an inch or so, and then that will just be stitched in place. So here's where the front placket is going to be. And here's a better idea of what the bottom edge looks like now that it's been finished with bias tape. Now for this placket, there were notches at the top, but I've extended my notches all the way along because we're wanting to fold the placket under, and I just want mine to be neat, so I kind of extended my lines all the way down. As I mentioned earlier in the video, the original pattern instructions ask you to fold this edge under at about 1/4 inch and then fold it again. I didn't want to do that, so I cut 1/4 inch off of the edge of this fabric and just finished it with bias tape, so now it can just be folded over once. So we'll pre-press the hem edge of our jacket under at about an inch or so. So I'll take this over to my ironing board and press this hem edge all the way along the edge of the jacket, and then we'll unfold it and do the placket, but having that hem edge pressed is going to make the final hemming process easier once we have the placket done. Once that hem edge has been pressed in place for the placket, all we have to do is fold this edge of fabric over to meet this other notch. So you want your notches to match up. So we're going to do this on the right side. So we'll just fold it over until our notches match up all the way along. And then we're going to stitch up here between our notches. And we're also going to stitch down here where our hem is going to be. And once that's done, the placket will be folded out like that. So I'm going to get started on that, and I'll kind of show you the process of this as I go along. Okay guys, so I just wanted to update you on a few things I just did off camera. So first of all, I finished off the placket by pressing it nicely in place, and then I top stitched along the edge of the placket from the outside. So then on the inside, this is what it looks like. You can see that I've just finished the edge with that bias binding rather than doing the double fold hem just to cut down on the bulk. And along with that, I did go ahead and finish this hem. So I showed in a previous step that I had finished the whole bottom edge of the hemline with bias tape, and I just pressed it under once at an inch seam allowance, and then I top stitched in place from the outside at an inch seam allowance all the way around, and it looks really nice and neat from the outside, and it also looks neat and tidy on the inside as well. So we are so close to being done this jacket. The last few things that need to be done, we need to get started on these sleeve cuffs and attach the cuffs to the bottom of the sleeves. We do, of course, need to add the collar onto the top here. You can see this is still a raw edge. And then the very last step, once all of that is done, will be to do the buttons and buttonholes along the front of the jacket, as well as the button and buttonhole on the sleeve as well. So for my sleeve cuff, I cut one piece of the cuff out of the main fabric, but then I cut the other cuff piece out of a contrasting fabric, just simply because I wanted to cut down on the amount of bulk at the cuff. And the contrasting fabric will be on the inside, so you won't even see it anyways. I just used a bit of lining fabric that I had in my stash. If I had thought ahead, I probably could have purchased a better matching fabric, but it doesn't matter. I'm glad to use up some of my scraps anyways. And basically, to assemble the cuff here, what we're going to do first is, for your contrasting fabric, you're going to want to press the seam allowance under at 5/8 of an inch, and this will be the fabric that will be inside of your cuff. Then you'll sew the main fabric cuff and the lining fabric cuff right sides together all the way along the sides and bottom edge, but you're leaving that top edge open. Then you'll clip your corners and turn it right sides out and press it. And I used a knitting needle to poke out my corners to get a neat finish too. And then when I was done, this is what the cuff was looking like. So now that we have this cuff, we need to attach it to the sleeve. And I'm a little bit nervous because I think things are going to get very, very bulky, because this is where I have my ridiculously bulky sleeve plackets. But nevertheless, we're just going to attach them right sides together. So the main fabric is going to go right sides together against your cuff, and we'll kind of pin that all the way around. My fabric is unraveling like crazy here. So before I actually stitch these together, I'll go and neaten up the edges so I don't have all these little stray fabric bits in my seam line. So I'm just going to take care to make sure I line up the edges of the cuff to the edge of the sleeve perfectly. So this is what it looks like. I have my cuff pinned to my sleeve. Here's the opening where the placket is. And you can see that I've pinned the main fabric right sides together against the sleeve. And then once we've sewn it, we'll kind of flip it up like this. And this lining fabric will be inside, so you won't really see it. Before I actually sew this together, I'm going to see if I can grade any seams around this area to reduce the bulk, because things are getting really, really bulky with my fabric. But if you're using a more standard weight fabric, you likely don't have to worry about this kind of thing. Okay, so the last step is going to be assembling the collar and then attaching it to the jacket. Now for my collar, I again decided to cut one collar piece out of the main fabric and then one out of this contrasting lighter weight fabric that I just happened to have in my stash. So to make the collar, what we're going to do is press the seam allowance under at 5/8 of an inch along the neck edge and do this on the main fabric or the fabric that you want to be on top. And then for the underneath collar piece, we're just going to leave it unpressed. We'll place the two collar pieces right sides together, stitch along the sides and the bottom. Then we'll clip the corners and turn it right sides out and press it in place. And full disclosure, I actually already made a collar, but when I went to turn it inside out, I ruined one of the corners. I was trying to poke the corner out and I just poked a little bit too hard. And this fabric is really prone to fraying, so it just started fraying. And I was debating using it, but I thought, you know what, the jacket is turning out so well, I don't want to rush on the collar and have a mistake on the collar, especially because it's right on the front there. So I'm just going to quickly whip up another collar here, and this time I'm going to cut the corners more carefully, and I'm going to use some fray check on those corners before I even try to turn it right sides out. And hopefully with some more careful cutting and some fray check and maybe a couple lines of reinforcement stitching, it will turn out a little bit better this time. So let's go ahead and make the collar. So this is what my collar piece is looking like. You can see I did some top stitching all the way around the edge of the collar. You could also do this towards the end, but I just wanted to get it done now to kind of stabilize the collar. And I also didn't want this contrasting fabric peeking out on the right side, so top stitching along the edge will help to keep it in place. So here's the neck edge of the jacket, and now we're going to start pinning the collar piece right sides together along the neck edge of the jacket, just starting right here, and go all the way around like so. So the under collar piece is pinned right sides together against the main jacket. So now we just need to stitch this seam line. And then you can see that once we've stitched that, the collar will kind of flip up, and then we'll use this folded edge to hide the seam allowance on the inside, like that. And this is the final step before the buttons and buttonholes, so let's get sewing this collar piece to the jacket. Okay, last but not least, it's time to do the buttons and buttonholes. So I used this buttonhole guide to mark my buttonholes on my pattern. As always, I did a test buttonhole on a piece of scrap fabric. I used top stitching thread to do my buttonholes. Once I was done sewing all the buttonholes, I used fray check on all of them before I cut them open, since this fabric is really prone to fraying. Once that was done, I marked my button placement and then hand stitched all of my buttons on. I did the same process to add one button and one buttonhole to each arm cuff. Alright guys, with the buttons on, we're all done and it's time for the reveal. Okay guys, so I just finished my work on this beautiful floral jacket and here's the final result. Overall, I'm so happy with this jacket and I'm happy with the pattern I chose. So let's talk more about this project, my thoughts on the pattern, the fit, the fabric, and all of that. So first off, I think this pattern is really great. This Friday Pattern Company Ilford jacket is a super simple sew. So the pattern is really made up of only a few pieces. You've got your front pieces, your back piece, one piece for the sleeves, the cuffs, and the collar pieces. And that's it. There's no darts, there's no fancy fitting. It's just a lot of sewing straight seams. And the sleeves are kind of a raglan sleeve style, so you don't have to worry about any fussy inset sleeves. In terms of the fit of this pattern, I made mine in a medium, which is my usual size. And since I figured this was a unisex or genderless pattern, that a medium would be really safe and have a little bit of extra room, because I wanted my jacket to fit pretty boxy. But I will say, because of the thick fabric I used, my jacket came out just fitting me. I would have much preferred if it was a little bit boxier. So for example, when it comes to the fit of these sleeve cuffs, these just fit around my wrist. Same with the kind of bottom area of the sleeve. So I much prefer when I have more room when it comes to things like my sleeve cuffs, but for me, these just fit me. And I would say I have like narrow to average wrists. So that's something to keep in mind for sure. If I made this again, I would definitely make this sleeve cuff a lot longer. So I probably should have sewn up this pattern 1 or 2 sizes bigger for a boxy fit. The fit of this right now, I could wear like a t-shirt or a long sleeve shirt underneath it, but that's it. I wouldn't be able to like throw this on over top of a sweater or anything, which kind of makes it a little bit less practical for day-to-day life. I also really like the pairing of this pattern with this fabric. So initially I was considering making a Nova coat or another long winter style coat out of this, but my mom actually gave me some great advice and reminded me that with a busy pattern like this, sometimes it's best just to do something a little bit shorter. So when I wear this jacket, it's just a statement on my top half instead of my whole outfit being a statement. So I think it's just a little bit more wearable because of that too. And I do think the playful nature of this fabric lends itself well to this pattern. So overall, in terms of how they paired together, I'm really happy with it. So there are a couple of things I wanted to point out. This is one of the first projects I've made where there are several visible flaws, and these resulted from a couple of errors on my part. First of all, this is definitely an upholstery fabric, so it's really 2 layers of fabric that have been kind of tacked together at certain points throughout the fabric, and it's very loosely woven. So as soon as I cut it, it started to unravel, and whenever I would sew with it, sometimes the needle would cause it to puncture and unravel as well. And so when it came to areas with really tight curves, like the point of the collar or the sleeve placket area, those areas had to have the seam allowance graded down a lot. But what ended up happening is that the fabric started fraying on the right side of my project. The fraying was so bad for the collar that I actually ended up making a second collar, and it's a lot better, but I'm still noticing some fraying. My sleeves and sleeve plackets are fraying a lot. I have been using some fray check to try to keep them in place, but I might go in and do some strategic decorative top stitching or some sort of decorative stitch to try to keep the fraying in check. So that's really too bad, and it's something I wish I had thought through a little bit more. I don't know how I necessarily could have fixed this because I already took a lot of care when it came to trimming my seam allowances using fray check, turning things out to the right side. I was being really careful. I think a wiser choice for this fabric in terms of the sleeves would have been to do the sleeve without the placket. So the placket got really, really thick and bulky. It honestly looks a little bit funny, like it kind of looks like just a giant growth on the side of the sleeve. So I think if I was to make it again, I would have just accepted the fact that I probably shouldn't do plackets and I should have just done the sleeve without the plackets, and that would have helped as well. Last thing I wanted to mention in terms of construction would be the area where this collar piece meets the placket at the front. Again, because of the nature of the fabric I was using, it was really prone to unraveling and it was really thick. It was kind of hard to sandwich this placket piece in between this collar right and wrong side, and it just looks a little bit messy there. I was able to fix this area with some stitching and some fray check, but I think this construction lends itself much better to a thinner fabric for sure. So I was also pretty happy I chose to use a contrasting fabric for the cuffs as well as the underside of the collar here. I think I'd kind of wisened up by this point in the project to realize that I couldn't do a double layer of my main fabric. It would just be way too thick. So I'm glad that I did do a contrasting lighter weight fabric. I think it looks really great, and I think it did its job in terms of cutting down on the bulk in those areas. So that was great. So in terms of my seam finishes as well as my lining situation, overall I'm really happy with the seam finish that I chose, the bias binding. It took a little bit of extra time, but it wasn't crazy or anything like that. And since the actual construction of the jacket was easy, I feel like the binding of the seams was actually the most time-consuming part, but I didn't mind doing it. And I'm really glad I opted for no lining with this jacket. It's already a good weight. It feels like a really heavy denim jacket. And I think if there was any more weight to it, I probably wouldn't want to wear it. If I did want to line it again, I would definitely size up for sure, so I had some extra room. So last but not least is the buttons I chose. I always love choosing buttons at the end of a project. Am I the only one who thinks it's such an important design detail? I really feel like the buttons can make or break a project. So I spent a little time combing through my collection, and I already had the perfect buttons in my collection for this project. The buttons I chose to use are natural wood buttons, and they are in this kind of warm brown color, and I think it matches really well. And I also have matching warm brown buttons on the cuffs of the sleeves too, so they're the exact same buttons, just in different sizes, which I really like. So that concludes this project today. I'm so excited to start styling this jacket. Please let me know what you thought of this project in the comments below. If you liked this video, please consider giving me a thumbs up, and if you like videos like this, please subscribe to my channel. I do all sorts of sewing related content, and I'm also going to be posting some fall related content coming up soon as well. Okay guys, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!